The silence was the first thing you noticed. Not a polite, attentive silence, but a heavy, breathless one. The kind that follows a lightning strike before the thunder rolls. In the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons, under the crushing weight of 1,000 Swarovski crystals dripping from the ceiling, 200 of the city's most powerful people had forgotten how to breathe. Their conversations about stock portfolios, summer homes in the Hamptons, and political donations had evaporated, leaving a vacuum. All eyes, a sea of calculating, curated faces, were fixed on the stage, on the man standing at the podium and the woman standing beside him. The man was David Sterling, a name that was less a name and more a number. $4.2 billion. He was in a Tom Ford tuxedo that probably cost more than the average car, but he wore it with the unease of a man who preferred denim. It was his foundation's inaugural gala, a night to celebrate philanthropy, a night for the city's elite to write checks and feel good about themselves. But David hadn't been talking about tax deductions. He had been telling a story, and now he had just brought the woman on stage. She wore a gown of deep cobalt blue, with threads of pure gold woven into the silk, creating patterns that echoed the Ankara fabrics of her homeland. She was not a socialite, not a celebrity, not a politician's wife. To the 200 people in that room, she was a complete unknown, and her presence on that stage, hand in hand with David Sterling, was a disruption to the known order of things. One woman in the crowd, a woman named Brenda, felt the silence more acutely than anyone else. Her face, a carefully constructed mask of expensive foundation and Botox, was beginning to crack. The Chanel dress felt tight, the diamond earrings heavy. Her heart was hammering against her ribs with a frantic, terrified rhythm. She knew that woman. She knew her from the harsh, fluorescent lights of a budget grocery store, from behind the sticky conveyor belt of checkout lane 4. She was just a cashier, a nobody. Brenda's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible tableau on stage. David Sterling lifted the microphone. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but it filled the vast, silent room. He didn't look at the audience. He looked only at the woman beside him, his eyes full of a reverence that no one in that room had ever seen from him. He said, "Her name is Amina Okoro, and she is the reason we are all here tonight. She is the chair of this foundation. She is my moral compass, and she is my future wife." He paused, letting the words land like stones in a still pond. Then he added one more sentence, a sentence that shattered Brenda's world completely. "Because a year ago, when I had nothing, she gave me everything she had. It was $18.67, and it saved my life." The collective gasp was audible. Phones, which had been discreetly hidden under napkins, came out, their screens lighting up the stunned faces in the dim ballroom. Brenda felt the blood drain from her face. $18.67. The number echoed in her memory, a ghost from a Tuesday afternoon she had tried to forget. In that moment, the cashier, the nobody from lane 4, looked out across the sea of faces, her gaze calm and dignified, and her eyes met Brenda's. There was no malice in them, no triumph. There was only a quiet, devastating grace. And for Brenda, that was the most terrifying thing of all. If you love stories where a single act of kindness changes everything, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the return on this investment is going to be priceless. Now let me take you back to where it all began. To understand the weight of $18.67, you have to understand what it meant to Amina Okoro. It wasn't just money, it was time, it was survival. A year before she stood on that stage in a gown woven with gold, Amina's life was measured in increments of exhaustion. She was 34 years old, and she hadn't had a full day off in 3 years. Not since her son Tunde was diagnosed with asthma that required a specific, expensive nebulizer and medication that her minimal insurance barely touched. Her life was a map of bus routes between her 2 jobs. Job 1 was from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. at the Grove Mart, a discount grocery store where the lights hummed with a weary buzz and the air smelled of stale bread and cleaning fluid. Her feet, swollen in her worn-out sneakers, ached with a deep, permanent throb. Her hands were dry and cracked from handling thousands of items a day, from the cold metal of canned beans to the rough cardboard of cereal boxes. She was fast, efficient, her movements economical. She had to be. Her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Gary, watched the transaction per hour metric like a hawk. Job 2 was from 5 p.m. to 11 p.m., cleaning offices in a downtown skyscraper. This job was lonelier. It was just her cart of supplies, and the ghosts of the day's commerce. She would empty trash cans filled with crumpled papers detailing million-dollar deals. She would wipe down boardroom tables where fates of companies were decided. She would scrub toilets used by people whose shoes cost more than her monthly rent of $1,450 for a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the far edge of the city. In those quiet, empty hours, she would listen to podcasts about starting a small business, her mind alight with the dream that kept her going. The dream was of spices, of palm oil sizzling in a pot, of the rich, complex aroma of egusi soup and the comforting heft of pounded yam. She dreamed of a small food stall, maybe a cart at first, called Tunde's Table. She was a phenomenal cook, a gift inherited from her mother and grandmother in a small village outside Lagos. Her jollof rice was a thing of beauty, each grain separate and infused with a smoky, savory flavor that she could conjure from memory. She knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that if people could just taste her food, they would love it. She had the recipes, the skill, the passion. What she didn't have was capital, or time, or energy. By the time she got home at midnight, her body screaming with fatigue, the most she could manage was to check on a sleeping Tunde, kiss his forehead, and set her alarm for 5 a.m. to do it all over again. Her life was a series of calculations. The bus fare was $2.75 each way. 4 trips a day, that was $11. Tunde's medication was $87.45 a month after insurance. The rent, the utilities, the cheap groceries she bought with her employee discount at Grove Mart, every single penny had a name, a destination, a purpose. There was no room for error, no space for impulse, no budget for kindness to strangers. Her emergency fund was a collection of loose change in a ceramic jar on her kitchen counter. It held at that time $43.12. Her only real connection to her past, to her soul, was the weekly phone call with her mother in Nigeria. Her mother, a woman of profound faith and simple wisdom, would speak to her in a mixture of Yoruba and English. She would listen to the exhaustion in Amina's voice and offer not pity, but proverbs. "When the river is full, it does not make noise," she would say. "Your blessings are gathering quietly, my daughter. Be patient." Or, "A stranger's eye can see the pearl in the oyster that the fisherman misses." It meant, be open to the world, for you never know where help will come from. Amina would cling to these words like a life raft in the turbulent sea of her life. Then there was Brenda. Brenda was a recurring character in Amina's life at Grove Mart, a weekly trial of her patience. She was a woman in her late 40s who lived in the wealthy enclave on the other side of town, but drove to Grove Mart because she'd heard they had the best organic kale, a fact she seemed to resent. She dressed in Lululemon athletic wear that had never seen a gym, carried a Louis Vuitton bag, and drove a white Range Rover that she always parked across 2 spaces. Brenda treated the grocery store staff as invisible obstacles. She would talk loudly on her phone while piling her expensive organic items onto the conveyor belt. She never made eye contact. She complained if a coupon didn't scan. She was the kind of person who demanded to speak to a manager over a 10-cent price discrepancy. She had singled out Amina for a special kind of disdain. Perhaps it was Amina's quiet dignity, her refusal to be flustered. Brenda seemed to take it as a personal challenge. 3 specific encounters stood out in Amina's mind. The first time, Brenda had accused Amina of overcharging her for an avocado. "You people are always trying to scam someone," she'd said, her voice dripping with contempt. The manager came, voided the transaction, and rescanned it. The price was correct. Brenda didn't apologize. She just sniffed and snatched her receipt. The second time, Tunde had a particularly bad asthma attack, and Amina had to leave her cleaning job early to take him to the emergency room. She was running on 2 hours of sleep, her eyes burning, her heart a knot of worry. Brenda came through her line, her cart overflowing. As Amina scanned, her hands were trembling slightly. Brenda noticed. "Can you be any slower?" she snapped. "Some of us have important places to be." The words, so casual in their cruelty, hit Amina with the force of a physical blow. The third time was the week before the incident. Brenda was buying a ridiculously expensive birthday cake. The cashier next to Amina, a young college student, accidentally smudged the frosting while bagging it. Brenda erupted. She called the girl incompetent, stupid, and demanded the cake for free as compensation for her emotional distress. The girl was in tears. Amina watched, her heart aching for the young cashier, her hands clenched into fists under the counter. She saw in Brenda a profound emptiness, a soul so starved it had to feed on the humiliation of others. She didn't forget her face. And fate, as her mother would say, wasn't done with Brenda. Fate was just setting the table. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. The sky was the color of a dull nickel, and a chilly rain was misting the windows of the Grove Mart. The after-work rush was just beginning, and the lines were starting to snake back into the aisles. Amina's back was a column of fire. She hadn't slept well. Tunde had been coughing all night. She was running on lukewarm coffee and sheer willpower, her mind already on the bus she had to catch to get to her second job. A man stepped into her line. He was unremarkable, and in Amina's world, unremarkable was a blessing. He was in his late 30s, with kind eyes that had fine lines at the corners, as if he smiled more than he frowned. He wore a simple, well-worn flannel shirt, faded jeans, and work boots that had seen better days. He looked tired, but in a different way than she was. His was a quiet, internal weariness. He placed his items on the belt with a gentle efficiency. A loaf of whole wheat bread, a carton of milk, a small bag of apples, a jar of peanut butter, and a small, bright blue toy car, the kind that cost $3 or $4. Amina scanned the items. The total came to $18.67. The man pulled out a debit card and slid it into the machine. Beep. Card declined. He frowned slightly. "Oh, that's strange. Let me try it again." He ran it a second time. Beep. Card declined. Insufficient funds. A flicker of embarrassment crossed his face. He was trying to hide it, but Amina, a student of human struggle, saw it clearly. It was in the way his ears turned a faint shade of red, the way he avoided her eyes and stared at the pin pad as if it had personally betrayed him. I think I left my wallet in my other jacket," he said, his voice low. "I'm so sorry." He fumbled in his pockets, pulling out lint and a single crumpled dollar bill. It was a transparent performance of searching for something he knew wasn't there. Behind him, the line was growing. A woman with a toddler was shifting her weight impatiently. An elderly man was sighing audibly. And directly behind the man, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the handle of her overflowing cart, was Brenda. Of course, Brenda was there. She leaned forward, her voice a stage whisper designed to be heard by everyone in the vicinity. "For heaven's sake, if you can't afford to buy groceries, maybe you shouldn't be in a grocery store. And trying to buy toys, no less. Some people have no shame." The man flinched as if he'd been struck. The color drained from his face. He looked down at the little blue car on the counter, and his expression was one of such profound, quiet devastation that it pierced Amina's exhaustion. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was heartbroken. In that moment, Amina didn't see a stranger. She saw the weary slump of his shoulders, the shame in his eyes, and the toy he couldn't buy. She thought of Tunde and how his whole world could light up over a simple, small gift. She thought of all the times she'd had to say, "No, baby, not today." Something inside her shifted. It was a decision made not with her head, which was screaming at her about the $43 in her emergency jar, but with her heart. She thought of her mother's proverb, "A stranger's eye can see the pearl in the oyster." "Just a moment," she said, her voice soft but clear. She looked past the man, her gaze locking with Brenda's for a brief, steady second. Brenda's sneer faltered, surprised by the directness. Then Amina looked back at the man. "It's okay," she said. "Don't worry about it." Before he could protest, she pulled her own debit card from the small wallet tucked under her register. It was a well-worn card, the numbers faded from use. With a few swift, practiced movements, she tapped the card on the machine. Beep. Approved. She quickly bagged the items, the bread, the milk, the apples, the peanut butter. She took special care with the little blue car, placing it right on top. "Here you go," she said, handing him the bag. "Have a good day." The entire line had gone silent. Not the heavy, shocked silence of the gala, but a stunned, disbelieving silence. The woman with the toddler stopped bouncing. The elderly man stopped sighing. Even Brenda was speechless, her mouth slightly agape. No one knew what to do. A cashier had just paid for a customer's groceries. It was an act so contrary to the transactional nature of their world that it broke their brains for a moment. The man just stared at her. His eyes were wide. "But I can't let you do that." "It's already done," Amina said with a small, tired smile. "It's only $18. Just pay it forward sometime." She turned to her register light and switched it off, a signal that her lane was closing for her break, a move designed to end the conversation and disperse the gawking crowd. The man stood frozen for a moment, the plastic bag clutched in his hand. He looked from Amina's face to the receipt in his other hand, then back to her face. He opened his mouth to say something else, but no words came out. Instead, his eyes welled up. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He nodded, a quick, jerky motion, turned, and walked out of the store, the automatic doors sliding shut behind him. Amina sank onto her stool, the adrenaline leaving her as quickly as it had come. Her heart was pounding. $18.67. That was a day's worth of bus fare and Tunde's lunch money for 3 days. It was a significant portion of her emergency jar. A wave of panic washed over her. What have I done? But then she remembered the look on the man's face, the defeated slump of his shoulders, and the raw gratitude in his eyes. And she knew she would do it again. Brenda, finally finding her voice, pushed her cart forward to the next open lane. "Unbelievable," she muttered to the cashier, a young man who wisely pretended not to hear. "Giving money away to some deadbeat. That's why she'll be stuck in this dead-end job for the rest of her life." Amina heard her. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and thought of another of her mother's proverbs. "The one who throws stones forgets. The one who is struck remembers forever." Amina assumed she would never see the man again. He was a fleeting moment of connection in a life of transactions, a story she might one day tell Tunde about kindness. She put the incident out of her mind and focused on the relentless mathematics of her survival. The $18.67 left a small but noticeable hole in her budget, one she filled by working an extra 2 hours of overtime at the cleaning job, her body protesting with every scrub of the mop. 2 days later, she was back at her post in Lane 4. It was the mid-afternoon lull, that quiet period between the lunch rush and the evening onslaught. She was restocking her plastic bags, her mind drifting to what she would make for dinner, when a familiar figure appeared at the end of her empty lane. It was him, the man from Tuesday. He was wearing the same faded jeans, but a different flannel shirt, this one a muted green. He wasn't holding a shopping basket. In his hands, he held 2 paper cups of coffee. He approached her register slowly, a hesitant smile on his face. "Hi," he said. "I'm David." Amina's heart gave a little jolt of surprise. "Amina," she replied, her voice quiet. I didn't know if you like coffee or tea, so I got one of each, he said, placing them on the counter. One was a black coffee, the other a chai latte. It's the least I can do. I also wanted to give you this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill, crisp and new, and laid it on the counter. Thank you, Amina said, genuinely relieved to have the money back. She reached for it, but he gently placed his hand over hers, stopping her. No, he said, his voice earnest. Thank you. You have no idea what that meant to me. It wasn't about the money. Well, it was that you saw a person, not just a problem in the line. Amina looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. The kindness in his eyes was not a fleeting thing. It seemed to be a core part of his being. She felt an unaccustomed blush rise in her cheeks. She took the chai latte. It's my favorite, she said softly. How did you know? He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made the lines around his eyes crinkle. A lucky guess. He stayed for a few minutes, leaning against the counter and making small talk. He asked her about her day, about the store. He had an easy, unassuming way about him that put her at ease. He didn't ask any probing personal questions, yet he listened with an intensity that made her feel heard. When a customer finally came into her lane, he said his goodbye and left. He came back the next day, and the day after that. It became a ritual. Around 3 o'clock, David would appear with 2 cups, one coffee, one chai latte. He would stay for 10 or 15 minutes during the quietest part of her shift. He learned her co-worker's name, Maria, an older woman with a sharp wit and a kind heart. He learned that Amina was from Nigeria. He learned she had a 7-year-old son named Tunde. Maria watched these daily visitations with a skeptical but fond eye. Mijo, this man, he doesn't come here for the conversation, she told Amina one afternoon after David had left. A man doesn't bring a woman her favorite tea every day just to be friends. He is fishing. Amina would just shake her head and smile. He's just being nice, Maria. Nice is once, Maria countered, wiping down her conveyor belt. Twice is a coincidence. Every day for 2 weeks, that's an intention. Amina didn't want to let herself hope. Her life had no room for the complications of a man. Her last experience with a relationship had been with Tunde's father, a man who had promised her the world and then vanished when he learned she was pregnant, leaving her alone in a new country with nothing but a broken heart and a fierce will to survive. She had built a fortress around her heart, and the walls were high and thick. But David was patient. He never pushed. He just showed up. One rainy evening, as Amina was leaving her shift, she found him waiting by the bus stop under a large black umbrella. Your chariot awaits, he said with a grin, gesturing to a beat-up, slightly rusted Toyota Tacoma parked at the curb. It's not much, but it's dry. Amina hesitated. I don't know. It's a long walk from your next bus stop to your apartment, especially in this rain, he said. Let me just give you a ride home. I promise I'm not a secret axe murderer. His humor was gentle, disarming. She found herself agreeing. The inside of his truck was clean, but cluttered with the detritus of a working man's life. Tools, blueprints, a thermos. He worked in construction, he told her, managing small renovation projects. It was a plausible story. He seemed like a man who worked with his hands. As they drove, he asked her about Tunde. Amina, who rarely spoke of her son to anyone but Maria, found herself opening up. She told him about Tunde's intelligence, his infectious laugh, his love for drawing superheroes. And she told him about the asthma, the scary nights, the constant worry that was a permanent resident in her heart. David listened, his eyes on the road, his expression serious and empathetic. He didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. He just listened. When they pulled up to her modest apartment building, he turned off the engine. Amina, he said, his voice soft, you're an amazing woman and an incredible mother. The words, simple and direct, landed in her heart like a soothing balm. No one had said anything like that to her in years. She felt that familiar, dangerous prickling behind her eyes. "Thank you, David, for the ride." "Any time," he said. He started driving her home every day after her Grove Mart shift. Sometimes he would have a snack for her in the truck, a granola bar or a bag of almonds. He'd ask about her day, and he'd remember the details. He remembered that Gary, her manager, was a stickler for clock-in times. He remembered that the office building she cleaned was the one with the terrible, slow elevators. One afternoon, he met Tunde. Amina had to pick him up from his after-school program, and David offered to drive her. Tunde, usually shy with strangers, took to David immediately. David didn't talk down to him. He asked Tunde about his favorite superhero, and they got into a serious, detailed discussion about the relative merits of Iron Man's suit versus Black Panther's. When they got back to the apartment, David noticed Tunde's drawings taped to the refrigerator. "Wow," David said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "You drew these? The perspective on this cityscape is really advanced for your age." Tunde beamed with pride. From that day on, David wasn't just Mom's friend. He was David. He started bringing Tunde small gifts, not expensive toys, but sketch pads and high-quality colored pencils. He would spend a few minutes with them before Amina had to leave for her second job, helping Tunde with his homework or admiring his latest drawing. Amina felt the walls around her heart beginning to crumble, brick by slow, uncertain brick. She was terrified. This feeling of being cared for, of being seen, was so foreign and so precious she was afraid to breathe on it for fear it would disappear. She began to tell him about her dream. Tentatively at first, she described the scents and flavors of her mother's kitchen. She told him about Tunde's table. She expected him to nod politely, to treat it like a cute little hobby. Instead, he took it seriously. "What's your signature dish?" he asked. "Jollof rice," she said without hesitation, "but the real, smoky, party-style jollof, and my egusi soup with pounded yam. People don't know what they're missing." "So what's stopping you?" he asked. Amina gave a hollow laugh. "What's stopping me? David, look around. I have no money, no time. A dream is a luxury I can't afford." "A dream isn't a luxury," he said, his eyes intense. "It's a necessity. It's the fuel. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." The conversation stayed with her. He had a way of speaking truths that she knew but had buried under the weight of her reality. He made her believe, just for a moment, that her dream wasn't impossible. One Saturday, Amina actually had a day off. A coworker had agreed to swap shifts with her, an unheard-of miracle. David proposed a picnic. "Just us and Tunde," he said. "I know a great spot. We can fly a kite." Amina agreed, a flutter of nervous excitement in her stomach. It felt like a real date. She spent the morning cooking, packing a basket with her famous jollof rice, fried plantains, and some chin-chin for a snack. She wanted to show him, not just tell him, about her passion. He picked them up in his old Tacoma. He was wearing the same kind of simple clothes he always wore. Tunde was vibrating with excitement in the back seat, clutching a new superhero kite David had brought him. They drove for nearly an hour, leaving the city behind and heading into the rolling green hills of the countryside. "Where are we going?" Amina asked, looking at the pristine, manicured landscapes flashing past her window. This was horse country, the land of old money and vast estates hidden behind long, winding driveways and imposing gates. "It's a park," David said vaguely. "A friend lets me use it." He turned down a long driveway marked by a simple, unassuming wooden sign that read, "Sterling Meadows." They drove for another 5 minutes, past fields where beautiful horses grazed peacefully, and up a hill that offered a breathtaking view of the entire valley. He parked the truck under a massive, ancient oak tree at the crest of the hill. "This is a park?" Tunde asked, his eyes wide as he looked at a sprawling, beautiful stone house in the distance that looked more like a castle than a home. "Sort of," David said, smiling. He spread out a large blanket on the grass, and they unpacked the lunch. The food was a revelation. David took one bite of the jollof rice and his eyes closed in pleasure. Amina, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This is, this is incredible. You can't keep this to yourself. It would be a crime against humanity. Amina laughed, a real, unburdened laugh. Seeing his genuine enjoyment filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. They ate, they flew the kite with Tunde, its superhero tail dancing in the wind. And for a few hours, Amina forgot about the bus routes, the aching feet, the endless calculations. She felt like a normal person, spending a normal day with a man she was beginning to care for deeply, and her happy, laughing son. It was perfect. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting a golden glow over the valley, Tunde lay down on the blanket, tired out from running, and quickly fell asleep. David and Amina sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky change colors. Then David turned to her, his expression serious. Amina, there's something I need to tell you. Amina's stomach tightened. She braced herself for the inevitable goodbye, for the reason why this couldn't work, for the other shoe to drop. The story I told you about my job? It wasn't the whole truth, he began. I don't work in construction, not anymore. Okay, she said slowly, her heart beginning to pound. This place, he said, gesturing to the vast expanse of land around them, the horses, the distant stone mansion. This is my home, Sterling Meadows. My name is David Sterling. The name meant nothing to her. She didn't read the business pages or follow the stock market. She just looked at him, confused. He seemed to understand. He took a deep breath. 10 years ago, I started a software company in my garage with two friends. It was a logistics optimization program. It did very well. A few years ago, we sold it to a larger tech conglomerate. He paused, and the next words came out in a quiet rush. My net worth on paper is about $4.2 billion. Amina stared at him. The number was so large, so abstract, it didn't compute. It was like trying to imagine the distance to the moon. She thought it was a joke. She looked for a smile, a tell, but his face was completely serious, his eyes searching hers for a reaction. Billion? She whispered. With a B? He nodded. Her mind reeled, trying to reconcile the man she knew, the man in the faded flannel who drove a rusty truck and drank coffee from a paper cup, with the astronomical number he had just uttered. It made no sense. The pieces didn't fit. Her first coherent thought was not about the money. It was about the grocery store. The card, she said, her voice barely audible. Your card was declined. He looked down at his hands. That was real. It was a debit card linked to a small account I use for daily expenses. I transferred most of it to another account to help my sister with a down payment on a house, and I forgot. I messed up the timing. I genuinely didn't have the $20 in that account at that moment. He looked up at her, his eyes pleading for her to understand. But the wallet, I didn't forget my wallet. I had other cards. I had cash. I froze. Why? She asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Because of the woman behind me, he said. The things she said. And the look on your face. I wanted to see what would happen. It was a terrible thing to do, I know. It was a test, not for you, for the world. And you broke the test. You did something no one was supposed to do. He told her everything then. He told her about his ex-wife, a woman who had loved the lifestyle, but not the man. A woman who, during their divorce, had told him that without his money, he was uninteresting and average. The words had wounded him more deeply than he'd ever admitted. After the divorce, he'd found himself surrounded by people who wanted something from him. He felt like a walking, talking ATM. He had become profoundly lonely, isolated by the very wealth that was supposed to give him freedom. So, he had started an experiment. He'd bought the old truck. He wore old clothes. He frequented diners and discount grocery stores. He wanted to see if he could find a genuine connection, Someone who would see him, David the man, and not David Sterling, the billionaire. "I was about to give up," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was convinced that my ex-wife was right, that without the money, I was invisible. And then I walked into your line, and you saw me. You didn't see a deadbeat. You didn't see a problem. You saw a human being who was hurting. You looked past the surface and saw the person underneath. You, Amina, with all the struggles you face, with every reason in the world to be cynical and closed off, you performed an act of radical kindness for a stranger." He reached out and took her hand. His was warm and steady. "Why you? Because in a world of transactions, you are a gift. Because you are the most authentic, resilient, and compassionate person I have ever met. Your hands may be calloused from work, but your heart is the softest thing I've ever known." Amina was silent for a long time, the world tilting on its axis. She looked at this man, this stranger who was not a stranger, and saw not the billions, but the loneliness in his eyes, the wound he carried. She saw the man who had talked superheroes with her son, who had listened to her dreams, who had brought her tea every day. And then she started to laugh. It wasn't a hysterical laugh, but a low, bubbling sound of pure, unadulterated absurdity. A billionaire. She had been worried about him being able to afford gas for his truck. "So," she said, a tear of laughter rolling down her cheek, "the forgotten wallet was market research?" He had the grace to look chagrined. "Something like that." The humor broke the tension, but underneath it, a wave of emotion was building in her chest. All the lonely nights, all the struggles, all the times she had felt invisible herself. And this man, this impossible man, had seen her, truly seen her. The tears came then, the second kind of crying, not of pain or laughter, but of overwhelming, heart-cracking relief. It was the cry of a soul that had been holding its breath for years and could finally exhale. He pulled her into his arms and she wept against his flannel shirt, the scent of him, clean and woodsy, filling her senses. He just held her, stroking her hair, letting her release it all under the vast, quiet sky of his impossible home. The weeks that followed were a surreal dream. David insisted that nothing had to change, but of course everything did. The first and most immediate change was that Amina quit her second job. David didn't just give her money. That would have felt wrong, like a transaction. Instead, he hired her. "I'm starting a new philanthropic foundation," he explained one evening. "The Sterling Forward Foundation. Its mission will be to provide seed capital and mentorship to small businesses started by immigrant women. I need a consultant, someone with first-hand knowledge of the challenges and the dreams, someone with impeccable character to help me build this thing from the ground up." He offered her a salary that was more than she made in a year from both her jobs combined. Her official title was Community Impact Advisor. She quit the cleaning job the next day. The relief was a physical sensation, an unclenching of muscles she didn't even know were tense. For the first time in years, she could be home in the evenings to cook dinner for Tunde, to read him a bedtime story, to just be his mom. They moved out of the cramped apartment. David had a guest house on his estate, a beautiful, cozy stone cottage that was bigger than any home Amina had ever lived in. He presented it as a practical solution. "It's just sitting empty," he said, "and this way we can have more meetings about the foundation." Amina knew it was more than that, but she accepted with a grateful heart. Tunde was ecstatic. He had a yard to run in, a room of his own, and he could see the horses from his window. His cough, in the clean country air, began to subside. But Amina didn't quit her job at Grove Mart. Not yet. She felt a strange loyalty to it, to the routine, to Maria. It was the last piece of her old life, and she wasn't ready to let it go. It kept her grounded. So for a few more weeks, David would drive her from their country estate to the budget grocery store in his old Tacoma. It was an absurd juxtaposition. a billionaire's girlfriend clocking in to scan coupons and bag groceries. During this time, Amina and David fell deeper in love. Without the constant pressure of survival, Amina's true self began to blossom. Her laughter was more frequent, her wits sharper. She cooked for him, filling his large, sterile kitchen with the vibrant, life-affirming smells of her homeland. She introduced him to Fela Kuti's music. He, in turn, showed her his world. Not the world of galas and boardrooms, but his private world. He showed her the garage where he'd started his company. He introduced her to his sister, a warm, down-to-earth veterinarian who embraced Amina instantly. He taught her how to ride a horse. They were building a life, a real one, based on the connection they had forged over paper cups of tea and conversations in a grocery store checkout lane. The foundation was not just a title for Amina, it was her passion. She and David spent hours crafting the mission statement, designing the application process. Amina insisted that the grants should not be based solely on business plans, but on character. "We need to fund the person, not just the idea," she argued. David agreed completely. Her first official act was to design a pilot program. The first recipient of a grant, she decided, would be for a catering business called Tunde's Table. David set her up with the best lawyers, accountants, and brand strategists. They helped her formalize her business plan, secure a commercial kitchen space, and develop a brand. It was happening. Her dream was taking shape, piece by tangible piece. Then came the invitation. It was for the Sterling Forward Foundation's inaugural gala. It was going to be the official launch, a major fundraising event. "And," David said, taking her hands in his, "I want to officially introduce you as the chair of the foundation, and as the most important person in my life." Amina felt a jolt of fear. Going public meant stepping into his world, a world of judgment and scrutiny, a world that contained people like Brenda. "Are you sure?" she asked. "They'll see me and just see a cashier. They won't understand." "Let them look," David said, his gaze firm. "It's time they learned what true value looks like." The night of the gala arrived. A celebrity stylist had come to the cottage, bringing racks of designer gowns. Amina had felt lost among the sequins and silk until she saw one dress. It was by a Nigerian-British designer, a stunning column of cobalt silk. What made it special were the threads of real gold woven into the fabric in a traditional Ankara pattern. It felt like her two worlds, her past and her present, woven together. When she put it on, she didn't feel like she was in a costume. She felt like herself, amplified. As she came down the stairs, David was waiting at the bottom. He was in his tuxedo, looking handsome but uncomfortable. When he saw her, he stopped breathing for a second. He walked up to her, his eyes full of awe. "You look like a queen," he whispered. "I feel like Amina," she said, smiling, "which is even better." They rode to the Four Seasons, not in the Tacoma, but in a sleek, black Rolls-Royce with a driver. As they pulled up, paparazzi flashbulbs exploded, a startling burst of light. David shielded her, his hand protectively on her back, as bodyguards escorted them inside. The ballroom was an overwhelming spectacle of wealth and power. Amina saw faces she recognized from the news, titans of industry and political figures, all mingling and sipping champagne. She felt a wave of imposter syndrome, a voice whispering that she didn't belong here. Then she felt David's hand find hers, his grip warm and reassuring. "You belong wherever you want to be," he murmured, as if reading her mind. They were seated at the head table. Across the room, Amina spotted a familiar face. It was Brenda. She was with a harried-looking man, presumably her husband, and she was scanning the room with a hungry, predatory gaze, clearly networking. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Amina saw a flicker of confusion on Brenda's face, a look that said, "I know you from somewhere," before she dismissed Amina as unimportant and turned away. Amina felt a strange sense of calm. The power dynamic had shifted so completely, it was almost comical. After dinner, it was time for David's speech. He walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. He started by thanking everyone for coming, for their generous donations. He spoke about the foundation's mission, and then his tone shifted. "I started this foundation," he said, his voice becoming more personal, "because I learned a very hard lesson. I learned that my net worth has nothing to do with my self-worth. I learned that the most valuable assets we have are not in our stock portfolios, but in our character." He paused, and the room was silent, hanging on his every word. "About a year ago, I was at a low point. I felt cynical, lost. I felt invisible. And one afternoon, I was in a grocery store. I didn't have enough money for my items. It was a small amount, less than $20, but it felt like a fortune of shame. The people in line were impatient. One person in particular was cruel. They said things that confirmed my worst fears about the world, that people only value you for what you have, and that if you have nothing, you are nothing. Across the room, Brenda had gone rigid. A dawning horror was spreading across her features as she began to connect the dots. Her husband was looking at her, a confused frown on his face. "But then," David continued, his voice softening, "something remarkable happened. The cashier, a woman who I could tell was exhausted, a woman who was clearly struggling far more than I was, did something no one expected. She didn't judge. She didn't sneer. She looked at me, and she saw a person. And she paid for my groceries. With her own money. It was $18.67. He let the number hang in the air. "It was the single most generous gift I have ever received. It wasn't about the money. It was an act of pure, uncalculated grace. It reminded me that there is still goodness in the world. It saved me." His eyes found Amina's at the head table. He smiled. "That woman taught me that the person who gives when they have nothing is richer than the person who takes when they have everything. She is the inspiration for this foundation, and she is the person I trust most in the world to lead it." He held out his hand. "Please join me in welcoming the chair of the Sterling Forward Foundation, Amina Okoro." Amina stood, her legs trembling slightly, and walked to the stage. A wave of applause, hesitant at first, then thunderous, filled the room. She joined David at the podium, and he took her hand. That's when he made his announcement, the one that made the whole room forget how to breathe. "Her name is Amina Okoro, and she is the reason we are all here tonight. She is my future wife." He spoke the words with such profound love and conviction that they settled over the room like a benediction. Then he added the final, devastating detail about the $18.67. The gasp, the phones, the stunned silence. Amina looked out and saw it all. And she saw Brenda, her face a mask of utter ruin, the Chanel and diamonds suddenly looking like a cheap costume. In that moment of public triumph, Amina felt no desire for revenge. She just felt a quiet, profound sense of peace. Her mother was right. The river had been full, gathering its blessings quietly, and tonight it had finally, majestically, overflowed. The aftermath of the gala was swift and decisive. The story of the billionaire and the cashier went viral, a modern-day fairy tale for a cynical age. But for Amina and David, it was just the beginning of their real life. Amina dove headfirst into her work at the foundation. She proved to be a natural leader, her empathy and first-hand experience giving her an insight that no business school degree could provide. The foundation thrived, changing the lives of hundreds of women, creating a ripple effect of empowerment and opportunity. Tunde's Table also launched, starting as a high-end catering company that quickly became the most sought after in the city. Amina's jollof rice became legendary. Within 2 years, she opened her first brick-and-mortar restaurant, a beautiful, welcoming space that felt like an extension of her own kitchen. It was an instant success. She never lost her humility, often found in the kitchen herself, sleeves rolled up, stirring a pot of a goosey soup, her laughter echoing off the walls. She was happy. She was fulfilled. She was home. She and David married 6 months after the gala. It wasn't a lavish affair for thousands. It was a small, intimate ceremony on the hill, under the old oak tree where he had first told her the truth. Tunde was the ring bearer. Maria from the Grove Mart was Amina's maid of honor. Amina's mother flew in from Nigeria, her eyes shining with pride. Inside their simple gold wedding bands, David had engraved a small, secret inscription. $18.67, a reminder of their beginning. For Brenda, the consequences were just as swift, but far more brutal. The story, with its unnamed but easily identifiable cruel woman in line, spread like wildfire through her social circle. Her husband, whose construction business was heavily leveraged and built on a foundation of perceived success, found that his calls were no longer being returned. Business partners grew distant. Credit lines dried up. The whispers followed them everywhere. The public humiliation was a crack in their facade, and under the slightest pressure, the entire hollow structure of their lives collapsed. Within a year, they lost everything. The Range Rover was repossessed. The house was foreclosed on. The marriage, built on status rather than love, crumbled under the weight of failure. About a year after her first restaurant opened, Amina was having lunch there, sitting at a small corner table going over some invoices. A woman came in, looking hesitant. She was thin, her clothes neat but worn. Her face was etched with lines of worry. It took Amina a moment to recognize her. It was Brenda. Brenda was working as a temp, she explained, her voice low and stripped of all its former arrogance. She was on her lunch break and only had a few dollars. She asked if she could just get a small side of rice. Amina looked at the woman who had once tried to humiliate her. She saw no triumph, only a fellow human being who was struggling. She got up from her table, went to the counter, and spoke quietly to her manager. A few minutes later, a server brought a full, steaming plate of jollof rice, chicken, and fried plantains to Brenda's table. "It's on the house," the server said with a smile. Brenda looked up, confused, and saw Amina watching her from the counter. Brenda's eyes filled with tears of shame, and perhaps for the first time, a glimmer of understanding. She nodded once, a gesture of silent, profound gratitude. Amina simply nodded back, then turned and walked into her kitchen. The circle was complete. She had not sought revenge. She had simply lived a life of grace. And in the end, that was the most powerful statement of all. True wealth is not measured by the zeros in your bank account, but by the depth of your character. A heart that gives when it has nothing is infinitely richer than a hand that takes when it has everything. Because money can be lost, status can fade, and pride can be shattered. But an act of kindness, a moment of true grace, echoes for eternity. It is the only currency that truly matters, the only investment that yields an infinite return. If this story moved your heart, subscribe and hit that notification bell, because every tale has a lesson, and Alfred's folktales never forget.